guys, today we're going to talk about how to take apart, clean your reels between the seasons. Today we're cleaning an Abu Garcia Revo S. You can see it works, but could be a lot smoother. Doing some quick adjustments, that's about as good as I'm going to get out of this reel before I clean it. Some things you need. You need some basic tools, pliers, needle nose, Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, the small ones. You need a toothbrush. I like a kid's paintbrush, an old toothbrush and a kid's paintbrush. Get yourself some good oil. This is Ardent, hot sauce, real oil, also some good grease. As a general rule of thumb, grease goes on the inside, oil on the outside. Can't go without Q-tips, some paper towels, a little jar or dish of rubbing alcohol. Rubbing alcohol is important because it evaporates rather quickly, whereas water will sit, and you don't want water on any part of your reel. You'll probably notice I've got a white cloth here. This is an old, bath towel. I love to have a white towel on my surface because, as you'll see, it'll get dirty. This is why you use an old one, but you'll be able to actually tell, and find little pieces, sometimes little clips, little springs. They will pop out, and when it lands on the towel, one, it won't roll anywhere. Two, because it's white, you'll be able to pick it out a lot easier. So let's get started. We're just going to take apart the reel. It's very easy. Just take all the different screws off in their different spots, and then we'll get into the different components of the reel. Start by taking the side plate off. We'll clean that up later. I always like to work left to right. So as you see the reel here, the schematic will explode this way. I'll put all the parts for the left side of the reel on this side, all the parts on the right side of the reel, starting from the far right side and moving in as I get towards the middle. You can see where the tape comes in. The line's not bouncing off, coming off anywhere. I'm going to go in here and we're going to actually start taking off all of the screws. You can see right there's one. Right down here there's a little port. It requires a screw to be taken out, and the port comes off. You can see the port. And now there really is no particular order that you need to do this. You do have to take these screws out to get to the inside, but you also need to take the nut off of the handle and explode the handle schematic portion off as well. So we'll get to that here in a second. So this one has 4 screws. You can see I've got all 4 screws lined up right there. You can see it's starting to kind of come apart a little bit. What we need to do now is take that nut off. You take this little screw, little bracket, and you'll see I'm just starting to line them up as you'd see on a schematic. Vice grips, whatever you got. It's important to note all the parts and the direction they're going. As I come off, it goes right down. This has an actual little piece on the back side. Make sure you don't lose that. Drag star. Now the first set of washer stacks for the clicker, I usually just try to take all of them off at once and then stack them together. This sleeve, there's a little washer as well. Make sure you don't lose that. It's also important to check which direction the sleeve comes off. You can see this actually has a little bit of a channeled portion on the top portion, and on the inside of the bottom portion it's just circle around. That is to keep that spaced when it goes back on there. So that's important because if you put it the other direction, it's not going to space correctly. So all those things have come right off and put in order. Take the cover off, and you'll see the inside of this reel actually looks pretty clean. Not a lot of excess buildup. This is probably the first season of use for this reel. I take the drag stack off. You can see this also has the reel engage gear, so it doesn't get out of order. This is the pinion and the yoke. You can take that straight out. We'll clean those separately. And then you're really left with the inside of the reel. Like I said, this looks actually pretty clean. Let's take off the rest of the pieces. Actually have a little bit bigger flathead for the cap on the pawl. This is oftentimes where a lot of your reel performance gets gummed up is actually in the worm gear, and that's why it's important to take all of these things out and off and clean these specifically. So here's the pawl. And then we need to take off this little clamp right here. It's a C-clamp, and those C-clamps are very, very springy. And if you lose them, they're tough to find because they're so small. But what we're going to do here is we're going to angle it so the opening of the clamp faces outward. And so when you pop it off, it's going to go into the reel. That's a great way just to avoid having it pop off here and out the reel somewhere. You stick your thumb in there. See how it just popped right to the edge of it? Now I can control where it goes. There's a couple little washers in there. All right, so we'll keep that right there. So now you'll see I actually have access now to take the worm gear apart. So here's the worm gear. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's the guide, roller guide. We'll talk about that. And then you'll see this is the actual worm gear. And you can see really easily, if you can see that or not, very gunky. And it's that kind of stuff that slides up and down this whole bar. And that's all friction that will, limit the range of speed of your reel. All right, so you can see now we're just down to the basic frame. I'm not going to, for today's video, I'm not going to take apart this part of the component. It's actually fairly easy. You just take the screws off right here, pops right off. Sometimes more high-end reels will have a bearing underneath there. It's good to put oil on those bearings and or clean them. But like I said, this reel is pretty clean. We're not going to go to that depth. There's really no immediate need to fix that. All right, so for the cleaning, I'm just going to take my good old highly used toothbrush. And this reel doesn't have too much on it, but you want to get all that grime off, especially those that have been used for frogging or flipping. There's a lot of matted grass. A lot of times you'll get a lot of green algae gunk. It's this kinds of stuff, that you'll see kind of come off of reels. So we're going to put it in some water and just start scrubbing. You can see there's a little bit of grime. This one is not too bad, actually. Take one of these and just kind of go around some of the tougher to reach areas. You can see a little bit of stuff start to come off. Like I said, this one's not too bad, but some of those reels you're going to get, and they are just going to be caked and gunked, and you're going to have a lot of stuff that you're going to have to kind of scrub off. Make sure get right up along the edge where the spool rests. Clean any gunk that may come along that channel. Now the frame is basically set, and then we start to work on the different components. So now we got the case clean. Let's go and start to put a little bit of oil. Today, I'm just going to use the hot sauce because, one, it's red and you'll be able to see it a little bit better as to where each of the spots go that I put a little bit of grease. The first is on this little spot here. Now, if there was a lot of grease buildup in here, I would have cleaned all of that out as well. Again, I don't take the toothbrush, but I'll take a cloth, I'll wipe it around, I'll clean some areas out. I'll take a Q-tip, clean out some of these areas. The thing you want to be careful of is you don't want to have any of those fibers left over stuck in there because those will obviously cause a little bit of friction and things like that. I like to put some on that little peg. Most reels have that. This is where it's the thumb bar control. Push the thumb down and it disengages the spool. You re-engage, put that back up, and we'll put a little bit on the spring, a little bit over here on this spring, and then I just put just a little bit on the posts, and I'll show you what I do there. Then I take just a kid's little paintbrush, and I just apply it. A little bit of grease goes a long way. You don't have to put a lot on, just kind of dab it on. Because you don't want too much grease or it will start to, it will interfere with the motion. Just enough so you don't have a lot of friction. All right. Now we're just going to turn this over and start cleaning all the rest. Moving to the worm gear. And take the guide, swipe it down real well, set it aside. Let's take apart the worm gear. A lot of worm gears have this little pin. You don't want to take that out. Slide the gear off, and then the actual gear pinion itself, you push through, slides out, and you'll see here you're left with the casing. There is a bearing right inside. So we'll talk about cleaning those here in a second. You can see this actually has quite a bit, I don't know if you can see that really well or not, quite a bit of grease all built up. There's a lot of theories on this, but most people prefer or would say do not put any grease on the worm gear itself, only oil. This is clearly way too much grease. So we're just going to wipe this off. Sometimes if there's no grease at all or there's been no oil applied, there'll be gunk down in the grooves. And that's when you just take your toothbrush, get a little bit of, the rubbing alcohol. There's no other gunk. Set that aside. Here we have the casing. Now this is one that usually gets really gunky. There's a lot of stuff on it. You'll see after I wipe this thing down, there's going to be a lot of junk, even with cleaner reels, that goes on, especially on the inside. And this is where using again, Q-tip will start to come in handy. Just take it in, roll it around. You can see all that extra grease. The extra grease down at the end. This doesn't have to be perfect science. If you wanted to soak this in rubbing alcohol and you wanted to scrub it, you could. I'm trying to do this just for the sake of time. Got it pretty clean. One of the other things I like to do is just take a paper towel, thread it through, just kind of spin it for some of those hard to reach areas. Do the same thing over here. Spin it around. Relatively speaking, that's pretty good. Now this one I do, the encasing for the pawl, you gotta clean this really well. There is a lot of gunk down in there. Just gonna take this out, and you can see a lot of old grass, grease. I'll take something like this corner and I'll put it right through the line, get it snug, and then twist. Gets any gunk that's on the inside of the eye, so your line has a free guide through. You don't want extra line nicks or anything like that from gunk getting clogged up. All right, again, there's a lot of different ways. You can YouTube ways to clean bearings, acetone and things like that. We're not going to do that today. These are just stock bearings. We're going to keep them in as stock bearings. If you wanted to replace them, you can get kits for all of that. So we're just going to go through, wipe all these pieces off. You got it pretty clean. Now, something that I'll just make a note of is this user actually, you can see it's actually slightly cracked. A lot of these little cosmetic finishes are very, very fragile. So just be careful when you're using this, not to put too much pressure on there, because this is just plastic. It will crack. It will cause, and then you got to buy a new one if it gets to be too bad. All right. You also want to make sure you clean the pawl. I just take my fingertips. If you wanted to take a little brush or something and get down in there, you could. All the little grooves. That's where this goes through the worm gear, and if there's too much gunk in there, it won't ride in the grooves correctly, and it'll get snagged up. Sometimes one of these teeth will actually bust off too, and you want to make sure that if that happens, you're basically going to need to get a new one. So buy a replacement part before the other one goes, because once the other one goes, it's just a pain. You got to dig it out. It's usually jammed in there and whatnot. So just watch for that each year. Make sure this is not wearing down unevenly, or that there's no nicks or weakness in it, because that's a standard common flaw of those, especially the old ones that used to be ceramic. They would crack rather easily. All right, so now I've got pretty much everything to put the worm gear back together. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I've got the center of my reel here, and we're going to start putting things back together. So let's start with the worm gear itself. The worm gear is going to go in. Again, I know this, but the kind of notched side goes in and through the reel, and so therefore the hole for the pin needs to come in this direction. Hold that in place. We're going to stick the bearing in. One of the things I like to do right here, some reels have bearings on both sides. The higher end reels, there's more bearing counts. Just to keep good tolerance, is you take your oil, anything that's going to be moving quite a bit around things, just put a drop of oil. You can see just a little bit right on there. Let it spin. Got just a little drop of oil. So that when this bearing sits on there, it's sitting on a little bead of oil to help it spin. Before I put the gear on, I'll put another drop of oil right onto the bearing itself. Take the gear. You're going to need the gear with the notch side out, because you're going to have to put that little pin in. And this is where, again, the little needle nose will come. If you got steady hands, you can do it that way too. All right. So I've locked that in. You can see, push it down, it sets it right in there. All right. So now we're going to feed this through. This is Paul case or guide. Just going to thread this on. Easier said than done. All right. The next thing is we're going to have to line up this cover. Line up this component and then put the cover on. So this is oftentimes where some people kind of get hiccups here, is because this piece has to fit right in there, or the other side is not going to sit perfectly square. So this is just a little kind of a bushing. Like I said, sometimes there's bearings in there. I like to put a little drop of oil right on top of it. So this acts like a bearing. And again, this is where you just have to mess with it a little bit. Get that to lie flat. There we go. You can see just enough clearance there where you can put these spacers. Put the two spacers that were on this spot. Again, just one little drop. And then we get the C-clamp. All the while, I'm keeping my finger on the other side so it doesn't fall through. I line up the C-clamp. Again, I try to line it up on the back side so that if it pops off, it's not popping off too far. You'll hear it click, and now your gear is at least locked in place. Next thing is, take your guide. Now this side has a notched smaller end and a notched larger end. The notched smaller end will actually fit perfectly in here, so if you put it the wrong way, it won't fit all the way. So that's one way to know you're doing it right. We'll stick that all the way through. All right, now that we got that on, before we put the cover back on, we've got that gear guide on there. We put the little pawl back in there, and you had to see it has to kind of go down in there. That's when it's in the groove. If it's sticking up too far, it means it's not in the groove yet. So just kind of wiggle it till it gets on there. Then you put the cap on to hold it in place. Make sure you have the little spacer that's in there. A lot of times there's a spacer. Again, don't strip. This is a plastic on plastic. Just lightly tighten. So now when you move the... And that is held in place by the cover. Sometimes there's a little plate that some manufacturers will put there. But you can see it slightly covers that little screw right there, or the covering. Little screws back in place. You don't want to strip them, you just want it nice and snug. All right, so now you've got the front assembly basically complete. One of the things, again, some people will go through and do the everything at the end with the grease and oil. I like to do it as I go, just so I don't forget. One of the things I do is I actually put a little bit of grease, very, very lightly, on the actual worm gear inside. Some people say don't do it at all because it will pick up gunk, but if you put a very light amount, it will actually keep some corrosion and things like that from in there, and it will keep it a little bit more lubricated in between uses. If you use oil regularly, it's not as necessary, but when I'm doing other people's reels, and I don't know how much they're going to be using, I put a little bit in there, and I just put a little drop in each side. And then what I do is I turn it, put another little drop, and you can see it's very light. I mean, it's just a little piece. And you spin it, put some more on the other side, basically a little dollop. And then here's where I use my paintbrush. I'll take that paintbrush and I'll get it down in those grooves so it's evenly spaced. I'll spin it, keep kind of painting it on ever so slightly. It's like arts and crafts for fishing. You can kind of see a little bit of that red in there. And then this is where you put the oil. You just put a little drop in each little thing, and spin it, put some on this one side, one little drop, and that is going to be well oiled and lubricated for a good portion of the season. Sometimes I also put a little or drop of oil, I should say. You put that on there, it'll stay on there. Just a little less friction, a little more opportunity for it to slide freely. If you think about it, when you crank the reel over, this spins, go back and forth, and any friction in here, buildup of grease, gunk, any of that kind of stuff, that's going to slow down the amount of revolutions you can get out of a... That is the front component. All right, set that aside. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start to put together all the gears and the pieces that go into here. The thing I like to start on first is the pinion and the yoke. This is also probably the second most common item for buildup. Now this one is really, really clean, almost too clean. If you see here, there is almost no grease on the inside of this. This is where your spool basically spins and gets the traction from the handle. A lot of times you'll get grease buildup right on the inside ring of this, and that buildup will prevent that handle from spinning freely. Grease is not a good lubricant for speed. It's good for durability, but not for speed. Either way, we're going to just wipe this down, clean it off. If there was a lot of gunk in there, I might take a toothbrush to it just to get it nice and clean. Sometimes you got to get down in the holes. There'll be a lot of gunk down in there, but this one is really, really clean. Once that's clean, you take your pinion. A lot of times, take the toothbrush, get in between the gears. Remember this? It's really good to send that through You can see a lot of gunk came off right when I put that through. That's just grime and buildup of grease and oil. Dirt, you can see all of that grime coming right through there. That was not there minutes ago. That's just from the inside, and that's actually where the spool, this spool, you can actually see, if I wipe this, you can see all of that oily grime. That's just buildup that's sitting on the spool. Sometimes there will be an actual pin. Rather than a long spool, it'll be a short pin and a shorter spool. But that sits inside of there like this, and that's what spins your spool. And so there's a bearing portion that sits out here. This is the control cap. It goes all the way through into the control cap. That's where you get your spin, your cast control. So having that nice and clean sitting inside of that bearing is going to make sure your spool spins really, really well. All right. Well, I've got the spool here. I'm just going to wipe this down really well, actually on both sides. And let's put the yoke back together. I like to sit this flat, just like this. Grab your yoke, grab your gear. Now, the main portion of the gear is going to sit on top. The slotted portion is going to go down because that's what's going to grab the spool. It goes together like this, but what I like to do is I like to put a little bit of grease just along the edges, just again, ever so lightly down on the inside. And then I put a slight bead of grease inside. Over time, once your reel is used, the grease will build up inside of there from the main gear, and you'll see it when we apply that. I'll take this, make sure it just gets a little evenly coated, and then we'll slide that in. Then it just slides down on the posts. Again, we put just a little coating of grease, and you just take the springs. The spring actually has a little bit of gunk on it. A common reel repair is these springs. When these springs lose their kind of bouncy spring to them, or they're not stretched far enough, or they aren't the right kind of spring, or they're whatnot, or they break, or they pop off sometimes, your thumb bar will, this is basically the spring that will push the gear back into position, and it'll force it back down and close this back up. But when those springs are not up to snuff, it will have a hard time pushing that bar back up or to stay up. So when you cast the reel and you hear and the gear's grinding, a lot of times it's because your springs, something in this section here is not up to snuff. Now that that's back on, let's get back to putting together the stack. So you can see I just dropped the whole stack here. On the inside, there's going to be, this is the piece that helps re-engage the spool. Oftentimes you're going to have another washer or something like that. Then you have the main gear stack. It's really important you don't get these out of order. If you do, make sure you go out to a schematic. I take those all out. I set those aside. That's the drag setting. And then what I like to do is I like to take a fresh paper towel, fold it over, just give it a good scrub. You know, if you wanted to, you could get your dip this into the alcohol if it was really kind of built up grease, things like that. You'll be able to tell because there will be a lot of stuff inside of the grooves. Sometimes I'll even run it along the towel itself. Those little extra fibers sticking up will actually kind of pick off some of the extra. And if it's really bad, just take your little toothbrush, clean out the individual teeth. All right, then come back, wipe it down again, make sure you get all it off. Sometimes I'll take a Q-tip and go right around the ring if your gear has one of them. See, just enough gunk. Then I'll take each piece and I'll wipe them off for a while. I should note, before we get to that, I actually put a little bit of grease back on these little guys. So I stick that on. I usually just cover the small gear with a little bead of grease along the top. You can kind of see just like that. And then as you spin it, it's going to cover and coat most of the other pieces. All right, so let's guide that back down. It's slotted, so make sure it lines up fully or you're not going to be properly aligned. Another drag washer. Push your main gear down. This is going to line up exactly with the pinion gear. Sometimes just inspect the drag set. Sometimes there's grease on this, so I'll just clean it off. But you can see here, it's got 3 washers. Sometimes the outer washer will get nice and worn. Sometimes I'll swap those out for the rear one. Just like that. Slide those on. And you can see this has a little slot, a little piece that you have to line up. Line those up. Stick your top washer. It's got like a cymbal top hat raised right along the top edge. That goes up. Now your drag stack is reassembled. So right now we're basically at a spot where we can reassemble everything. But before we do, we want to put a little bit of grease right along this whole gear. And like I said, go through and re-inspect. You can kind of see I had a little bit of a paper towel left over right there from the teeth. Clean that stuff off. Take your grease. And what I do is I try to set it up, hold it in place. I'll try to lightly spin it. And it's just not even a full drop of grease, really. It's just kind of spreading out a little bead of it right along the edges. You'll see when you come through the other side. Just enough. You can see that right there. And as that gets worked in there, it will work itself into this gear. That's where a lot of the buildup is. When you get really bad grease, not good grease, it'll just kind of get gunky and build up in there. When there's not enough grease in there, you're going to have potential grinding of gears and things like that, where this piece will not want to move and it will try to pull at the teeth when you go to use it. So now that everything is re-greased, other things you can look for while you're in here is just to make sure that some of the grease is down along the back end of this. Sometimes put a little coating of grease around just some of the parts. That's entirely up to you. It's not as critical as the pieces I've shared. Now it's time to put your cover back on. But before you do, this is also another thing that gets a lot of grease. They will oftentimes grease that main gear and it will spread out over time on the inside. Now this is a really clean reel. There's not much grease that was in it to begin with. But I can guarantee that there will be reels that will have grease all caked up in here. And the other side of that is going through, taking a side of a Q-tip and just kind of going through the clutch. That's what they call that little insert there. Just go through. You see a little bit of buildup. You don't want to take everything out, but you don't want a lot of buildup in there either. Before you put the cover on, I always take this off just to inspect. Sometimes you can clean that out right down on the bottom. And before you close it up, put a dab of oil. Put that back in. Oh, this little spring wanted to pop over. Let's pop that back in place. All right, so that's in place. And then before I do, put a little spot of oil right inside the bearing. The nice thing about the hot sauce is it got that little small applicator. Other ones are like this. You just got to put a little dab and kind of smooth it around. That's going to help everything run real smooth from your spool perspective. All right, now let's put this back on. You got it through. Be sure that your springs don't pop off down in there because that's a common thing. If you tilt it sideways or something, those springs will come undone or fall off their posts. All right, now it's just putting the screws back in. Sometimes, whatever system works best for you, if you want to label them or put them in order. Inside, this is the bottom front, this is the top front. You can kind of see right here, this goes on the bottom left, this goes on the top right, this goes in the bottom right, and this one goes on the inside. However you want to keep track of them. I just happen to know it because I've done enough of these to know. Before you get too much further, just make sure things are working out. You can kind of hear the gears or get a little clinky in there. But what's going to happen is as soon as I put that spool in, it will line everything up, and you just don't want it to get too crossed up. All right, seems like everything is in good condition there. Finish the screws. Thank you, Abu Garcia, for making everything black so that it's tough to see. All right, all the screws are snug, but not over tightened. Now all we need to do is we need to reassemble the other pieces. Again, I just wipe this down. Excess anything is not good when it comes to keeping reels clean. Again, the slotted side goes on the outside. Make sure that goes all the way down. Usually there's a spacer or two. Make sure those go back in. Now again, I just lightly wipe these down. These tend to have some grease or oil on them. That's fine. In this particular case, you can kind of see these two spacers actually were put on incorrectly. These are unique spacers. They have a slight bend to them, and if you overlay them a certain way, they will line up exactly. I don't know if you can see that or not. But they're designed to actually work counter each other, kind of like that. So you get a little like the duck lips thing going, and that actually gives you your space. So there's a little bit of compression and give to those spacers as you open and close your drag star. So whenever you see those, you see two of them, just make sure they're aligned correctly so that they give you the proper use. That's all sitting back on there. I re-inspect the drag star. Again, just clean stuff up. You want stuff to be nice and neat. You don't want gunk all over it. Sometimes there's a lot of grease on the inside of the stack. It's tough to really see that kind of sheen, but sometimes I'll just kind of run that. You can see that grease, and I'll just reapply a small little. It's really bad. Put a couple little dollops in there. Take your little brush. You'll start to get this all the way on. You're going to have to hold the main pinion shaft. Hold it tight. Tighten it down. All right. Then you've got your other components. Just make sure you slide them all on as they came off. I always like to clean up my reels. If your reel has caps on the end, it's really important to take those caps off. Take the reel handles, the cork or the rubber or foam off. There's oftentimes a bearing or two underneath this, and it makes those spin really smooth. It's just a nice little feature. It's not necessary. You can see these are non-bearing paddles, but they work just fine. But it's just a nice extra kind of enthusiast touch that a lot of higher end reels do. So you want to make sure you go in and just put a drop of oil on those and whatnot. Slide that on. Slide your cap. Again, just tighten it up, snug it up. Don't wrench on it. Get it tight enough where it's snug. And then you're going to have this little extra cap piece. A lot of times it's just for alignment. Some reels have it, some don't. It just aligns up, and there's a little screw cap. Make sure it's snug enough where you can line that up. Sometimes if you wrench on it too much, it won't go in. You'll have to back it out anyway. All right. You can kind of hear that gear in there slipping just a little bit until I get that other piece in. So I'm gonna hold off on that. Again, we already wiped this down, but again, wipe it down. There is almost always, most new reels have a spool in here. This is what a lot of people will actually change when they change out the spools for baitcasting reels. They'll change this one out, and they'll change this one out right here. We're not going to do that today, but we want to make sure this is nice and clean. We've got a drop of oil just along that shaft, and sometimes I'll slide it up, put a drop on the inside. You don't want to go overboard with the oil, but you want just enough there to make a difference. All right, so we're going to put the spool in. We put a little bit of oil on the bearing, checked everything out, make sure it's free of debris and any nicks in the spool. As we go to put this in, what we're going to do is we're going to put a little drop of oil on this portion of the shaft. During the middle of the season, what you can do is you can take that cap off, put a drop in right on the shaft itself without taking it all apart. But that's going to keep everything nice and kind of lubed up on the inside. Slides right in. And then on this side, we wiped off the gunk on this piece. And what we want to do is, before we put the final cap on, we want to just wipe off any extra. You see there's a lot of kind of buildup on this particular thing. And then wipe around. Sometimes you have, this has just a roller guard, so to speak, of where the brakes will kind of run on. Some of the older reels have that. Some have magnetic stuff with the magnetic controls. Just make sure this is kind of free of gunk and issues. Sometimes you run it down through there, that kind of stuff. Because your spool is going to sit and rest right along the edge of this. And if there's nicks and there's gunk, that's going to come into play later on in the season. All right, before you slide it on, again, with every reel bearing, just a slight drop. I like to do a slight one on the inside, and then a slight one on the shaft itself. Everything's sitting on a nice bead of oil. Pops in, tighten it back up. Again, snug, but not too tight. There you have it. That's with 0 adjustments. So we took a reel that really, quite honestly, was in pretty clean shape. There wasn't a lot of buildup. There wasn't a lot of gunk. But you can see just how much a little bit can go. And if I were to crank this even down, that's fully cranked down on the tension knob. It still spins better than it did loosened up previously. There you have it.